September 13, 1940, 7:42 in the morning, Raffigan Hill, Kent. Sergeant Arthur Peetton stood in the shadow of atomaged Spitfire, watching black smoke rise from London's docks 20 miles north. The morning smelled of burnt aviation fuel and spent cordite. His hands, stained with gun oil and carbon residue, trembled slightly as he counted the bombers returning across the channel. 17 Yesterday there had been 23. Thematics of survival were getting worse, and Putin knew something the pilots didn't yet understand. The Germans weren't winning because they'd better planes. They were winning because they could shoot faster. For 3 weeks, Peetton had been pulling apart Browning machine guns from returning Spitfires, examining feed mechanisms that had jammed mid-combat, counting rounds that should have been fired but weren't. He'd found the pattern. British fighters were getting 8 rounds per second from each gun. Intelligence reports said the Messerschmitt 109s were managing almost 12. In a dogfight lasting 15 seconds, that difference meant death. The RAF was bringing engineering precision to a knife fight, and British pilots were dying because of it. What happened next would change aerial warfare forever, though it would take 30 years before anyone outside a classified hangar would know Peetton's name. He'd been a bicycle mechanic before the war, fixing racing bikes in a cramped Birmingham shop where factory workers brought their transportation for a pair. The RAF had made him an armorer because he understood small mechanical systems, the kind where a 1/16 of an inch mattered. His commanding officers considered him competent, but unremarkable. They had no idea that 3 days before the most critical air battle in British history, this quiet sergeant from the Midlands was about to violate every principle his superiors held sacred. The previous evening, Peon had watched Flight Lieutenant James Harker stagger from his cockpit after a running battle over Maidstone. The young pilot's face was gray, his flight suit soaked with sweat. He'd emptied all 8 guns at a Heinkel bomber from less than 200 Waldade. The bomber had flown home. Harker reported that his rounds seemed to be hitting, but not fast enough, not dense enough. The German rear gunners had time to return fire between British bursts. It was like punching through water. You could see the impact, but it didn't have the force to kill. Peetton had pulled the guns from Harker's Spitfire that night, working by torchlight in the maintenance hangar, while German bombers droned overhead toward London. The Browning 303 was a magnificent weapon engineered to tolerances measured in thousandth of an inch, designed by American craftsmen who understood that reliability mattered more than rate-off fire. The British had adopted it because it was dependable. It fed smoothly, jammed rarely, and could be counted on in the thin, cold air at 20,000 ft, but dependable wasn't winning the battle. The feed mechanism was the bottleneck. Each round had to be stripped from the munition belt, aligned with the chamber, fired and ejected before the next round could enter. The Browning did this with a system of springs and levers that moved with mechanical precision, each part waiting for the previous action to complete. It was beautiful engineering. It was also too slow. Peetton laid the gun on his workbench and stared at it for an hour. Somewhere in the distance, anti-aircraft guns thumped at raiders overhead. He barely noticed. His mind was working through a problem that had occupied him since childhood when he'd modified his own bicycle to climb the steep hills outside Birmingham faster than anyone else in his neighborhood. Speed wasn't about power. Speed was about eliminating the pauses between actions. Their revelation came at 2:00 in the morning. He was half asleep, slumped over the workbench when his hand knocked against a small parts bin. Bicycle chain segments spilled across the table, remnants from a repair he'd done weeks earlier on a corporal's commuter bike. The chain pieces fell across the Browning's feed mechanism, and Peetton suddenly saw the solution with absolute clarity. The gun didn't need better springs. It needed continuous motion. A bicycle chain never stops moving when you pedal. Each link transfers force to the next without waiting. The Browning's feed mechanism worked in stages with tiny mechanical pauses as each spring compressed and released. Those pauses added up. 8 rounds per second meant each round took 1/8 of a second toe sickle. If he could eliminate the pauses, keep the mechanism in constant motion like a bicycle chain transferring energy, he could increase the rate dramatically. The idea was absurd. Aviation engineers spent years calculating stress loads and failure points. They used advanced metallurgy and precision manufacturing. Peetton was proposing to modify a gun mechanism with parts salvaged from bicycles and whatever else he could scavenge. Every aeronautics expert in Britain would call it ridiculous. Every engineering manual would say it couldn't work. The tolerances were wrong. The materials weren't rated for the stress. And the whole concept ignored decades of weapons development research. Peetton started modifying the gun. Anyway, he worked through the night using a small grinding wheel to reshape the feed mechanism housing. The bicycle chain segments became guides for the ammunition belt, creating a continuous feed path instead of the staged system. From a broken sewing machine in the corner of the hangar, abandoned months ago by a WAFCler who'd given up on wartime repairs, he salvaged the tensioning spring. Sewing machines operated at high speed with continuous motion, and the spring was designed to maintain constant tension through rapid cycles. He modified it to keep pressure on the ammunition feed without the compress and release action of the original springs. The most radical change involved the firing pin mechanism. Standard Brownings used a simple spring return system. Fire, spring compresses, spring releases, ready for next round. Peetton replaced it with a system using clock springs wound in opposition, salvaged from 3 broken alarm clocks she'd been collecting in his footlocker. One spring drove the firing pin forward, the other pulled it back, and they worked against each other in constant tension. The firing pin never fully stopped moving. It was always ready for the next round. By dawn on September 14th, he had a modified gun that looked like it had been assembled by a madman. Bicycle chains, sewing machine parts, clock springs, components that had never been within a mile of an aircraft drawing board. He mounted it on a test stand in the corner of the hangar and loaded a belt of ammunition. The gun fired 18 rounds per second. The noise was different from a standard Browning. Instead of the measured hammering sound, a distinct tack, 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 the modified weapon produced a tearing rip like canvas shredding. The spent casing poured out in a golden stream. Peetton ran through 3 belts before he believed what he was seeing. He'd more than doubled the fire rate, 270 rounds in 15 seconds. A standard Browning would have fired 120. Then he discovered the first problem. The barrel was glowing red. The increased fire rate generated heat faster than the air cooling system could dissipate it. After 90 seconds of sustained fire, the barrel began to warp. Peetton stared at the drooping metal and felt his achievement dissolve. A gun that could only fire for 90 seconds was useless. He spent the rest of that day solving problems that proper engineers would have anticipated. The barrel needed better cooling. He couldn't redesign the entire cooling system, so he modified the blast tube, creating a Venturi effect that drew more air across the barrel during flight. It was crude, but it worked well enough to extend firing time to 2 and 1 to 2 minutes. More importantly, dogfights rarely lasted that long. Pilots fired in short bursts. If Pemberton's modification could survive 30 con bursts with 10-second cooling intervals, it would work in combat. The second problem was reliability. The modified mechanism jammed every 4th belt. The bicycle chain guides were creating friction points. Peetton spent hours polishing the contact surfaces, adjusting angles, testing, and retesting. By midnight on the 14th, he had a weapon that fired 18 rounds per second and jammed once every 20 belts. Not perfect, but usable. He reported to his commanding officer, Squadron Leader Christopher Webb, at 6, where in the morning on September 15th Webb was a by. The book officer who'd flown soap with camels in the previous wear, and deeply distrusted improvisation, listened to Pemberton's report with increasing skepticism, then walked to the hangar to see the modified weapon. Webb stared at the bicycle chains and sewing machine parts for a long moment. His face remained expressionless. Finally, he spoke. The modification looked like something assembled in a garden shed. It violated every principle of aviation engineering. The Air Ministry would never approve it, and they were going to install it in 12 Spitfires immediately because in 3 hours, German bombers were going to attack London in the largest raid of the war, and Webb was willing to try anything that might save British lives. The ground crews worked with desperate speed. Peetton had only modified one gun, but he'd mapped out the process. He taught 4 mechanics how to make the modifications, and they split into teams, each working on a different aircraft. The job that had taken Pemberton 12 hours took them 3 working together. By 10:38, Spitfires had the modification installed in at least 4 of their 8 guns. The other 4 guns remained standard Brownings, a hedge against complete failure. Peetton stood on the tarmac as the modified Spitfires taxied for takeoff. Flight Lieutenant Harker was flying one of them. As he rolled past, Harker looked down from his cockpit and gave Peetton a thumbs up. The sergeant didn't know if it was confidence or farewell. The pilots were betting their lives on bicycle chains and clock springs. The first radar reports came in at 11:20. Large formations crossing the channel. Very large formations. Every available fighter scrambled. The modified Spitfires climbed into a clear September sky, heading southeast toward the incoming bombers. Peetton waited in the hangar with the mechanics who'd helped install the modifications. Nobody spoke. They could hear the anti-aircraft guns start up over London, a distant rumble like continuous thunder. The radio room was off-limits to ground crew, but rumors filtered through. Massive formations, hundreds of aircraft. This was the moment the Germans had been building toward the knockout blow that would force Britain to negotiate. The fighters returned 90 minutes later. Peetton counted them in with his heart hammering. 2 missing from the morning flight, but 10 landed, including all 8 with modifications. Harker's Spitfire touched down trailing smoke from an overheated gun barrel, but it was flying. Harker climbed from his cockpit and walked directly to Peetton. The pilot's face was flushed with adrenaline and something else. Disbelief maybe, or vindication. He told the sergeant that the modified guns had performed beyond anything he'd imagined. He'd engaged a Dornier bomber from dead stern, fired a 3-second burst, and watched the Dornier's tail section disintegrate. 3 seconds, 54 rounds from a single gun. The standard Brownings in his other wing had fired 24 rounds in the same period. The difference wasn't incremental, it was overwhelming. The other pilots reported similar results. The modified guns tore through German aircraft with shocking efficiency. Several pilots had experienced jams, but the standard Brownings on the opposite wing had continued firing exactly as planned. 2 Messerschmitts had been destroyed by pilots who reported feeling like they were firing a different weapon entirely, something with physical weight behind each burst. One pilot, Flying Officer Robert Marsh, described engaging a Henkel-Hedden. In a standard Spitfire, head-on attacks were discouraged because the combined closure speed gave you perhaps 1 second of firing opportunity. Marsh had fired both modified guns for 1.5 seconds. 27 rounds from each gun, 54 total. The Henkel had come apart in mid-air. Marsh had flown through the debris field and landed with pieces of German aircraft embedded in his wing-leading edge. The Air Ministry received Squadron Leader Webb's report that evening. A bicycle mechanic had modified Browning machine guns using salvage parts and more than doubled their fire rate. The report was met with profound skepticism at headquarters. Webb was ordered to send the modified weapon to Farn for analysis. He sent one of the standard Brownings instead and apologized for a clerical error. By the time the confusion was sorted out, Pemberton had modified 43 Spitfires across 3 squadrons. The modifications spread through informal channels. Pilots talked to other pilots. Squadron commanders who saw the combat reports requested the modification. Peetton trained other armorers, and the technique spread across southern England's fighter bases. By late September, more than 200 Spitfires carried what was being called the Pemberton modification, though officially it didn't exist. The Germans noticed the change immediately. Luftwaffe intelligence reports from late September documented a sudden increase in British fighter effectiveness. Messerschmitt pilots reported that Spitfires were firing faster, that engagement times had shortened dramatically, and that German aircraft were sustaining more damage from shorter bursts. Some German commanders suspected the British had deployed a new weapon entirely. The Air Ministry finally got a proper look at the modification in early October. A team of weapons engineers arrived at Big Hill and disassembled one of Peetton's modified guns on a clean hangar floor. They examined the bicycle chains with obvious distaste. They tested the clock spring firing mechanism with barely concealed horror. They wrote a scathing report, concluding that the modification was a dangerous improvisation that would lead to catastrophic failures and couldn't possibly work as described. Then they went to the firing range and watched the gun fire 18 rounds per second without jamming. They examined combat reports showing significantly increased kill rates. They interviewed pilots who described the modification as the single most important improvement to the Spitfire's combat capability. The Air Ministry classified the entire program. Peetton was promoted to warrant officer and assigned to a classified weapons development unit. His modification was reverse-engineered by professional aeronautics engineers who spent 6 months figuring out why it worked, then redesigned it using proper materials and manufacturing techniques. By spring of 1941, British fighter guns incorporated the principles Peetton had discovered, though in a form that would never be mistaken for bicycle parts. The classification order remained in effect until 1970. For 30 years, the story of how a Birmingham bicycle mechanic had changed aerial warfare using salvaged parts remained locked in Air Ministry files. Peetton himself was forbidden from discussing his work. Even after he left military service in 1946, he returned to Birmingham and opened Asmall Motorcycle Repair Shop. He never told his customers that their mechanic had once outthought the entire British aeronautics establishment. The broader story of September 15, 1940 became legend. The day the Luftwaffe launched its largest daylight attack against London. The day RAF fighter command broke the back of the German bombing offensive. The day that convinced Hitler to postpone and ultimately cancel the invasion of Britain. History books called it the decisive day of the Battle of Britain. They credited radar, pilot skill, tactical brilliance, and British resolve. They never mentioned the bicycle chains. Statistical analysis after the war showed that British fighter effectiveness increased dramatically. In mid-September 1940, German aircraft loss rates jumped. British kill-to-loss ratios improved. Traditional explanations focused on pilot experience, improved tactics, and the advantage of fighting over home territory. All of those factors mattered. But there was another variable that the statistics couldn't easily capture. Starting on September 15th, British fighters simply hit harder. Peetton's story finally emerged in 1971 when the Air Ministry declassified wartime weapons development files. Air Searcher discovered the report Squadron Leader Webb had filed on September 15th, describing an unauthorized field modification to Browning machine guns. The researcher tracked down Peetton, then 73 years old and still running his motorcycle shop in Birmingham. The interview was brief. Pemberton remembered the work, but didn't consider it particularly remarkable. He'd seen a problem, understood the mechanical principles involved, and applied a solution. The parts he'd used were simply what had been available. If he'd had proper engineering resources, he probably would have designed something more elegant. But he hadn't had resources or time. He'd had 3 days before the largest air battle in history, and he'd done what made sense. Asked if he understood the significance of what he'd accomplished, Peetton shrugged. The modification had helped some pilots survive battles they might otherwise have lost. That seemed worthwhile. The fact that it violated every engineering principle and used parts from bicycles and sewing machines didn't make it less effective. Sometimes, he suggested the proper solution wasn't the one that came from proper channels. Flight Lieutenant James Harker, who'd flown the first combat mission with Pemberton's modification, was also interviewed for the declassified report. By 1971, he was Air Marshal Sir James Harker, retired, with a distinguished career that included 2 distinguished flying crosses and command of several important RAF installations. He remembered September 15, 1940 in vivid detail. He remembered the modified Spitfire, and he remembered thinking Ash fired that first burst into a Dornier bomber that he was suddenly flying a different aircraft entirely. The gun had made a tearing sound instead of the usual hammering. The tracers had poured out in an almost solid stream. The Dornier had come apart so quickly that Harker had initially thought he'd hit it with cannon fire. It was only later after landing that he'd realized what Pemberton had given him. Not just a faster gun, a weapon that transformed the entire nature of aerial combat. Engagements that previously required sustained fire could now be resolved in seconds. Deflection shots that barely scratched targets now shredded them. The margin for error had increased dramatically. Harker credited the modification with saving his life at least twice during the autumn of 1940. Perhaps more significantly, he credited it with changing his understanding of what was possible when creative thinking met desperate necessity. The most important innovations, he suggested in his interview, often came from people who didn't know the proper rules and therefore didn't understand what was supposed to be impossible. Peetton died in 1984, 3 months before his 86th birthday. His obituary in the Birmingham Post mentioned his military service, but not the details. A small funeral was attended by family, a few old customers from the motorcycle shop, and several elderly gentlemen who'd flown Spitfires during the war. They didn't speak much, but they stood together in the rain outside the crematorium, remembering Agramy Hanger at Biggin Hill and Assergent, who'd understood that engineering principles mattered less than keeping pilots alive. The Peetton modification is now a footnote in specialized histories of aerial warfare. The broader story focuses on radar, fighter tactics, pilot training, and strategic decisions. All of those elements mattered enormously. But on one specific morning in September 1940, when German bombers crossed the Channel in the largest formation of the war, British fighters met them with a weapon that fired twice as fast as anything the Germans had anticipated. The engagement lasted less than 2 hours. The bombers retreated. The invasion was cancelled, and in a hangar at RAF Big Hill, a former bicycle mechanic from Birmingham cleaned gun oil from his hands and wondered if the sewing machine parts would hold up through another day of combat. They did.